She is screaming for her mother. But no one moves. This is not a war. This is not a crime hidden in the shadows. This is a celebration. 700 women came to a religious festival, believing the gods would protect them. By nightfall, they were being dragged through torchlit streets by men they had never met, into houses they would never leave. What happened to them was so disturbing that Rome did not erase it, it sanctified it. For the next 1,000 years, every Roman wedding reenacted that night, the fear, the resistance, the forced entry, and then the world inherited those rituals, without remembering why. Today, we call it tradition. Rome called it survival. The women called it captivity. This is the story Rome built an empire to make you forget, and once you hear it, you will never see marriage the same way again. The night Rome turned screams into law. She thought she was protected because the gods were watching. She thought festivals were safe places. By the time she realized the truth, Rome had already claimed her body. The sun disappeared behind the hills, and with it went the last illusion of safety. Torches flared to life across the city, their flames shaking against unfinished stone walls, throwing violent shadows that stretched like claws across the ground. Rome was still young, still raw, still hungry. This was not yet an empire. It was something more dangerous, a city desperate to survive. The festival had been announced as sacred, a celebration for the gods. Music filled the air, drums beating steadily, hiding the tension beneath the laughter. Families stood shoulder to shoulder. Fathers relaxed, mothers smiled. Daughters leaned close, watching games they had never seen before. This was exactly what Rome needed them to believe. Hersilia stood among them, unaware that she had already been counted. She had entered the city that morning as a guest. She would never leave as one. Around her, Roman men watched the crowd with unnatural focus, not cheering, not distracted, their eyes moving methodically from face to face, from age to age. These were not glances of desire. They were assessments, calculations, selections made long before the torches were lit. The signal came without sound. One moment the music played, the next it stopped, abruptly, violently, as if the city itself had inhaled and refused to breathe. Then hands struck. Hersilia felt fingers crush into her arm, hard enough to bruise. She turned, confused, then terrified as another grip seized her waist. Around her, the world shattered. Women screamed, mothers reached out and were ripped away. Fathers surged forward and were struck down by armed men who appeared as if summoned from the darkness itself. This was not a riot. This was execution-level precision.
Rome had prepared for resistance. The visitors had not. Weapons had been left behind out of respect for the gods. Trust became their sentence. The streets filled with panic as women were dragged away, their sandals tearing loose, their hair coming undone, their voices rising until they broke. Some were taken by whoever reached them first. Others, the most beautiful, were carried carefully, protected, not from harm, but for delivery. Hersilia was pulled through streets she had never walked, torches blazing around her, lighting every step so she could not disappear. She screamed for her mother until her throat burned raw, until sound itself failed her. No one came. No one could. Rome had sealed the exits. By dawn, approximately 700 women were gone. The city stood silent, as if nothing had happened. The festival was over. The guests had fled. Rome's greatest weakness, its lack of women, had been solved in a single night of coordinated violence. What had been taken could not be returned without destroying the city itself. The women resisted. The ancient sources admit this, though reluctantly. They refused to eat. They refused to speak. They wept. They fought. Rome needed to break that resistance, not just physically, but psychologically. And this is where the real horror began. Hercules himself visited the captives. He spoke calmly, reasonably. He blamed their fathers. He promised them honor, citizenship, children. Then he said the words that would echo through Western history for centuries. Give your hearts to those to whom chance has given your bodies. Rome acknowledged the crime and demanded love anyway. This moment would not be erased. It would be transformed. The terror, the dragging, the resistance, the torches, the forced entry, all of it would become sacred ritual, not hidden, repeated, performed again and again at every Roman wedding for the next 1,000 years. But the women did not know that yet. They did not know their trauma would become tradition. They did not know their screams would be renamed romance. And they did not know that Rome's survival had just been purchased with their freedom, because what happened after this night would be even darker and far more permanent. When marriage was a weapon, Rome did not ask for consent. It demanded surrender and called it destiny. And then it forced love to grow inside a locked room. Mourning did not bring freedom, it brought reality. The women woke inside houses that were not theirs, surrounded by walls they had never crossed willingly. The city outside had returned to normal. Markets opened, men spoke calmly in the streets. Smoke rose from hearths as if nothing had happened. The violence had been compressed into a single night, sealed away, hidden beneath routine. This was Rome's first lesson to its captives. The world would not stop for their suffering. Hercilia sat in silence, her body aching, her mind suspended between disbelief and dread. She was no longer screaming. None of them were. Screaming requires hope that someone will answer. That hope was already fading. The men who had taken them did not behave like conquerors celebrating victory. They behaved like owners securing property. Doors were guarded. Food was offered and refused. Words were spoken and ignored. Rome had expected resistance. What it had not yet solved was how to turn stolen women into obedient wives. This was not a private problem. It threatened the survival of the city. If the women continued to resist, if they refused to eat, refused to bear children, refused to participate in Roman households, then the seizure would fail. Rome would collapse under the weight of its own crime. So Romulus intervened personally. Not with punishment, but with persuasion. The sources record his speech carefully because this speech would become one of the most important lies in Western history. He told the women they had been wronged, but not by Rome. He blamed their fathers for refusing intermarriage. He reframed abduction as inevitability. He promised them honor, status, legal protection, and citizenship. Then he delivered the sentence that stripped away the last illusion of choice. They were to accept what had already been done. Their bodies had been taken. Now they were expected to offer their hearts. This was not reassurance, it was psychological conquest. Rome was not asking the women to forget, it was asking them to reinterpret their trauma as fate, to believe that chance, not violence, had decided their future. To believe that resistance was childish and acceptance was wisdom. This logic would be repeated for centuries, not just in Rome, but wherever power needed obedience without chains. Still, the women resisted. So Rome escalated, quietly, methodically, without bloodshed. The captors were instructed to behave as husbands, not jailers. The women were given time, proximity, and isolation, separated from their families, surrounded by Roman language, Roman customs, Roman expectations. This was not kindness, it was conditioning. Rome understood something terrifyingly well. Captivity becomes permanent when escape disappears from the imagination. Days passed, weeks followed. Some women broke quickly, others did not. The sources are vague here, uncomfortable. They speak of eventual harmony, but they also admit that not all adjusted. Some remained silent, some mourned constantly, some resisted in ways the historians do not describe, and some disappeared from the record entirely. Then something irreversible happened. Children were born. This was the moment Rome had been waiting for. The birth of children fused captor and captive into a single unit that could not be cleanly separated. A woman could endure captivity, but what about her child? A child whose father was Roman, a child who would be rejected by the world outside the city. Rome did not need chains anymore. Biology did the work. When war came, and it did, the women were already trapped between two worlds. Their fathers and brothers marched to reclaim them. Weapons clashed, blood was spilled. Rome stood on the edge of destruction, and that was when the women were brought forward again, this time not as captives, but as symbols. They ran between armies, hair loose, clothes torn, carrying children in their arms. They begged both sides to stop. History would later call this bravery, sacrifice, love, but the truth was darker. They were choosing between two unbearable losses. If Rome fell, their children would lose their fathers. If their fathers won, their children would be born of men killed as enemies. Peace was made, Rome survived, and the women were never freed. This is the moment history claims everything was resolved, that the women accepted their fate, that marriage replaced violence, that order replaced chaos. But Rome had not erased the crime, it had only buried it beneath ritual. Because from this point forward, Rome would ensure that no one ever forgot what marriage truly meant, even if they no longer understood it. And the next step was to turn terror into tradition by forcing every bride to relive it.
The ritual that forced brides to feel fear. Her terror was no longer accidental. It was required, rehearsed, and witnessed. Rome turned trauma into law and called it sacred. Rome did not allow the memory of that night to fade. It refined it. It preserved it. It transformed raw violence into structured ceremony, ensuring that what had happened to the first captured women would never be forgotten, even when its meaning was no longer spoken aloud. This was not nostalgia. This was control. Rome understood that rituals do not simply remember the past, they train the future. The Roman wedding did not begin with vows or blessings. It began with seizure. On the wedding day, the bride stood beside her mother, surrounded by witnesses, fully aware of what was expected of her. At a precise moment, the groom's companions lunged forward and grabbed her. Not gently, not symbolically, they physically pulled her away as she clung to her family. She was expected to resist. She was expected to cry out. A bride who walked willingly was considered improper, even shameful. Fear was not a flaw in the ceremony, it was the ceremony. This moment was called the rapio, the taking. Roman scholars were disturbingly honest about its origin. They openly stated that this act commemorated the seizure of the Sabian women, not metaphorically, literally. Every Roman bride reenacted the moment when women were dragged away against their will so the city could survive. The scream that echoed through the wedding crowd was not embarrassment, it was memory, preserved in flesh. The procession that followed made no practical sense, which is how we know it was not about convenience. Torches were lit even during the day, surrounding the bride in artificial darkness. She was carried through the streets, lifted off the ground so her feet could not touch the earth. This was not honor, this was dislocation. The original captives had been dragged through torchlit streets at night, confused, terrified, unable to orient themselves. Rome recreated that sensation precisely because the feeling mattered more than the form. When the bride reached her new home, she was not allowed to step inside. She was lifted again and carried across the threshold. Later generations would invent romantic explanations, protection from bad omens, care from the groom. The Romans knew the truth. Prisoners do not walk into captivity, they are carried. The threshold marked the moment escape ended. Once crossed, the outside world no longer applied. Inside the house, the ritual continued.
The bride's hair was parted with the point of a spear, not a knife, not a comb, a weapon. Roman writers insisted this symbolized strength and fertility, but symbols matter because of what they normalize. This was a reminder that marriage was rooted in conquest, not choice. The spear was Rome's favorite tool. It had built the city. It had taken the women. Now it sanctified the union. Witnesses shouted a word whose meaning had already begun to blur: tellatio. By the classical period, Romans argued about its origin, but the oldest explanation linked it directly to the seizure. It was first shouted when men carrying a particularly desirable woman announced who she was being taken for, to prevent others from interfering. The word that echoed through joyful weddings began as a claim of ownership. None of this was hidden, none of it was accidental. Roman antiquarians documented these connections openly. The erasure came later, when repetition dulled recognition, when brides performed the motions without understanding why, when terror became expected, then normalized, then invisible. This is how Rome solved its moral problem. It did not deny the crime, it ritualized it. It made participation universal so no one could stand outside it and object. Every family reenacted the violence. Every marriage validated the past. The victims were honored in theory and overwritten in practice. But there was one problem Rome could never fully silence. Not every woman accepted her role. Some resisted for years. Some never spoke again. Some disappeared from the records so completely that even their names were lost. Roman historians rushed past them, focusing instead on the women who adapted, who produced children, who embodied the story Rome needed to tell. Silence became evidence. Survival became consent. By the time these rituals were performed, the original captives were gone. Their suffering had been absorbed into custom, but the fear remained, passed down from bride to bride, generation to generation, like a message written in the body instead of words. And Rome was not finished, because the final transformation was still to come, the moment when victims were turned into symbols and captivity was renamed honor.
When the captives stopped a war. They walked into the battlefield unarmed, not as wives, not as daughters, but as living proof that Rome's crime could no longer be undone. The war did not begin with speeches or declarations. It began with grief hardening into rage. The men who had returned home from the festival carried emptiness with them. Houses without daughters, families torn open in a single night. The Sabines and their allies did not debate what had happened. They named it clearly. Their women had been stolen. Their honor had been shattered. Rome would answer for it in blood. Armies gathered. Weapons were sharpened. Rome, barely born, prepared to be erased. The same men who had dragged women through torchlit streets now stood on walls with spears in their hands, ready to defend what they had taken. The city that claimed necessity now relied on violence to preserve the results of that necessity. This was not survival anymore. This was possession. Battles followed. Men died on both sides. The land between the hills darkened with blood, and still no resolution came. Rome could not surrender the women without destroying itself. The Sabines could not abandon their daughters without surrendering their identity. The war escalated toward a final confrontation that would decide whether Rome would continue to exist at all. Then, the impossible happened. As the two armies faced each other in the valley, shields locked, spears raised, something moved between them. Figures ran forward, not armored, not armed, not protected. Women, hair loose, clothes torn, faces marked by exhaustion and fear. Some carried infants in their arms, children born from unions that had begun in violence.
the battlefield froze. These were the captives. History would later describe this moment as heroic, as noble, as the triumph of love over war. But listen carefully to what the women actually said, because their words reveal a far darker truth. They begged both sides to stop, not because they were free, not because they were happy, but because every possible outcome would destroy them. If Rome fell, their children would lose their fathers. If their fathers won, their children would be born of men killed as enemies. Victory for either side meant unbearable loss. The women stood between armies because they were trapped between identities, daughters of one world, wives of another, fully belonging to neither.
This was not reconciliation. This was coercion reaching its final stage. The armies lowered their weapons. Negotiations began. Romulus met with the Sabine king. Terms were agreed upon. The peoples would merge. The Sabines would become Romans. The war would end. And history would call this peace. But the women were never released. This is the detail Roman tradition prefers to blur. The treaty did not restore choice. It eliminated escape. By absorbing the Sabines into Rome, the city erased the possibility of rescue. The women could not return home because home no longer existed as a separate place. Their captivity did not end. It was normalized. Rome celebrated this outcome as unity, as wisdom, as proof that violence could be redeemed by success. The women who had stopped the war were praised, remembered, spoken of with reverence. And then Rome did something that looked like honor but functioned as erasure. It named political districts after them. 30 voting divisions were named for the captured women. Roman writers presented this as tribute, as gratitude, as recognition of their role in founding the state. But the women themselves gained nothing. No freedom, no authority, no voice. Their names were attached to abstractions, administrative units, civic structures, while their actual lives remained confined to houses they had never chosen. This is how empires rewrite guilt. They name monuments after victims. They elevate suffering into symbolism. They replace justice with remembrance and call it resolution. The women became part of Rome's identity precisely so Rome would never have to confront what it had done to them. And one woman in particular became essential to this transformation. Hersilia, once a captive dragged through the streets, was reshaped into a figure of harmony, the model of acceptance, the woman who made peace possible. Her story was cleaned, simplified, sanctified. The terror of her capture faded behind the image of her virtue. But the truth did not disappear. It went underground. Because Rome had solved its military problem, but not its moral one. And to survive the weight of its own beginnings, it would need to do something even more disturbing: turn its victims into sacred figures so their suffering could no longer be questioned. That transformation was already underway.
How Rome turned victims into saints. They were never freed. They were never asked what they wanted. Instead, Rome immortalized them and erased the crime forever. Once the war ended, Rome faced a problem more dangerous than any army. The city had survived, but its foundation was stained with an act that could never be spoken of too loudly. 700 women had been taken by force. The empire that Rome dreamed of could not be built on a story so raw, so brutal, so obviously criminal. Power needs memory, but it also needs forgetting, and Rome was already learning how to control both. The solution was not silence. Silence invites questions. Rome chose something far more effective: sanctification. The women were no longer described as captives. They became wives, mothers, founders, bridges between peoples. Their suffering was not denied, it was reframed. What had been taken by force was rebranded as destiny fulfilled. Roman historians began to change the tone. The early fear, the resistance, the refusal to eat or speak was pushed aside in favor of a single repeated phrase. They eventually accepted. Acceptance became the most important word in the story because it implied consent without ever admitting it was missing at the beginning. Rome did not need the women to have chosen. It only needed history to say they stopped resisting. This is where Hercilia's transformation truly begins. In the earliest accounts, she is a woman seized during the festival, dragged away like the others. Later, she becomes something else entirely. She is described as noble, wise, calming, the woman who intervened between armies, the woman whose voice brought peace. Over time, her fear disappears from the narrative. Her captivity fades. What remains is a symbol, a woman who represents harmony rather than violation. Eventually, Rome elevates her further. She is honored, revered. In some traditions, she is worshipped. Brides are encouraged to pray to her for a successful marriage. Think about what that means. Future women walking into ritualized fear asked blessings from a woman whose own marriage began in terror. The victim became the guardian of the ritual that commemorated her suffering. This was not accidental, it was strategy. Rome understood that once victims become sacred, questioning the crime becomes blasphemy. You do not interrogate saints. You do not criticize founders. You do not reopen stories that have been declared holy. By lifting the women out of history and into legend, Rome sealed the narrative shut. But there is something the Roman sources reveal if you read them closely enough.
They mention, briefly and uncomfortably, that not all women accepted their fate. Some never adjusted. Some continued to mourn. Some resisted in ways that were not described, and some simply vanish from the record. No names, no stories, no honors. These women do not become symbols, because symbols require cooperation. Their silence is the loudest evidence of all. Rome's historians move past them quickly. Instead, they focus on outcomes. Rome grew powerful. Rome expanded. Rome built roads, laws, cities. The logic becomes clear. Because Rome succeeded, its origins must have been justified. The women's suffering becomes a necessary price for civilization. This is one of the oldest lies power tells itself, that success redeems violence. But rituals do not disappear. They linger, they repeat, they travel. Roman marriage customs spread across the empire, then into medieval Europe, then into the foundations of modern Western tradition. The bride carried across the threshold, the expectation of resistance, the symbolic removal from family. People forgot why these acts existed, but they kept performing them. Meaning faded, motion remained. This is how Rome finally won. Not by erasing the past, but by embedding it so deeply into daily life that no one recognized it anymore. The crime became culture, the trauma became tradition, and the women who had no choice were turned into proof that everything had been resolved. But history has a habit of resurfacing, because when you strip away the symbols, the prayers, the softened language, one truth remains impossible to ignore. Rome did not forget what it did, it made sure you would. And in the final part of this story, you will see why that forgetting still shapes the world you live in today, and why the shadow of that first Roman wedding has never truly faded.
The tradition that never ended. You are still reenacting it. You are still applauding it. And Rome is still watching. Rome did not survive because it forgot its crime. It survived because it taught the world how to live with it. By the time the empire reached its height, the story of the Sabine women had been cleaned, polished, and safely enclosed within legend. What began as mass abduction was now taught as romance. What began with screaming was now painted in marble. Artists carved scenes of beautiful women being lifted by strong men. Poets wrote verses about destiny and unity. Violence had been turned into aesthetics, and aesthetics are easier to love than truth. This was the final transformation, the most dangerous one. When a crime becomes beautiful, no one wants to question it. Roman wedding rituals spread far beyond the city itself. As Rome conquered, its customs followed. Provinces adopted Roman law, Roman language, Roman ceremony. The bride taken from her family, the performative resistance, the carrying across the threshold, the symbolic darkness. Each generation inherited the gestures without the explanation. Over time, the origin faded completely. People remembered how to do the ritual, but not why. That forgetting was the greatest victory Rome ever achieved, because once the meaning was lost, the ritual could no longer be challenged. Who questions a tradition when no one remembers its victims? Who feels guilt when the past has been disguised as culture? The world did not just inherit Roman power, it inherited Roman amnesia. Even today, echoes remain. A father giving away his daughter, a bride lifted and carried as guests smile, a symbolic separation from her family to begin a new life. These acts are explained with softer words now: love, protection, care, but the structure has not changed. The body moves, the crowd watches, the past repeats itself without asking permission. Rome understood something terrifyingly modern. If you repeat something long enough, it stops looking like violence. The ancient historians knew this story would disturb future readers. That is why they emphasized acceptance. That is why they praised outcomes. That is why they buried dissent in footnotes and silence. They wanted you to focus on what Rome became, not what it did. They wanted greatness to outweigh grief.
But history is not moral simply because it is successful. The women did not choose Rome. Rome chose them. Their bodies became the solution to a political problem. Their suffering became the foundation of an empire. And when that empire needed innocence, it turned the victims into symbols so no one would look too closely at their lives. Hersilia, once a screaming woman dragged through torchlit streets, ended as a name invoked in prayer. Not because justice was done, but because memory was managed. Her story reminds us of something uncomfortable. Civilizations are not built only with laws and roads and armies. They are built with narratives that teach people what to forget. Rome erased its crime not by hiding it, but by ritualizing it. And that is the most unsettling truth of all. Because it means history is not just something that happened long ago. It is something still happening whenever tradition is followed without understanding, whenever beauty replaces accountability, whenever success is allowed to excuse suffering. Rome fell, but its methods did not. The next time you see a bride carried across a threshold, remember this was once the moment escape ended. The next time you hear about ancient greatness, remember the voices that were required to go silent for that greatness to exist. And remember that forgetting is never accidental. Rome built an empire so you would stop asking how it began. Now you know. And knowing is the one thing Rome could never fully control.